what are the lessons of the last few days after the violence and the looting, the lessons that we need to learn? First, we obviously need to learn how to tighten up our systems to stop this kind of thing from happening again. But we also need to discuss what needs to change. In other words, changing the conditions on the ground that allow this to happen. You'll know these conversations. They're around inequality, they're around poverty, but they're actually about something much more fundamental than that, which is perhaps about giving everyone a stake in our society, making sure everyone feels that they have a chance. Angelo Fick is the Director of Research at the All Socio-Economic Research Institute. Angelo, good afternoon to you. I mean, let's just start with the sort of shorter-term stuff. I suppose the first question to ask is whether there were certain signals that this violence was going to happen and whether those signals were missed.
Good afternoon, Stephen, to you and to your viewers. Yes, I think anybody who had access to a television, a radio, or who had access to social media saw people make threats about infrastructure damage, about blocking roads in the week leading up to the arrest and taking to prison of Jacob Zuma. And, you know, some of us took those threats seriously. That government and various security agencies didn't take those threats seriously speaks volumes about what they imagined would happen. We've seen this happen before in this country where people publicly state on record what it is they intend to do and government simply doesn't take it seriously. The people of Bhuwani learnt that lesson when their schools got burnt over a period of weeks and the state security minister said that, oh, they'd known, but they didn't act. And so that speaks volumes about how government officials actually need to be held to account by, the executive needs to be held to account by the parliamentarians, the legislature, to account for why they didn't react in the expected ways to what was obviously publicly a visible threat. And we've had situations like this before where there is, you know, to use that phrase from the last decade, prima facie evidence that things are going to go wrong or that things have gone wrong, and government simply refuses this. Let's not forget the removal of Omar al-Bashir from South African space, where people showed photographs of the aircraft taking off, and the government's lawyer simply stood in court and said, well, that doesn't really count. We can't verify that. These kinds of actions have a long history in post-apartheid, post-millennial South Africa, and we really have to begin to intervene at that level. And so, yes, this was foreseeable, and government didn't react appropriately.
So one of the problems is, do you think that government just didn't think that this would happen? Do you think people were worried about being seen to overreact? Did they not want to give supporters of, I mean, let's say his name, the former president Jacob Zuma, too much power?
I think that there are split loyalties. There's loyalty to party, and then there is the loyalty to the security of the state as a whole. And people's loyalty really was tested over the last 10 days. And senior politicians going to Nkandla to support a man that they profess to love, chose to try and ameliorate a situation that wouldn't happen for the rest of us. Those of us who are not members of the governing party wouldn't get deputations of people coming to our homes to try and convince us to go to prison. The police would simply arrive and we'd be arrested for our contempt of court behavior, even if it is in something as negligible as refusing to appear in a magistrate's court on charges of not paying papgeld or, not appearing on a charge of theft. And ordinary South Africans are aware of this. The fact that there are two systems of justice in practice when there should be one system of justice, not just on paper, speaks volumes to how party, issues, internal dynamics of the governing party seem to play a role in people having to do what they are required by the Constitution and by law their offices to fulfill. And that, I think, is part of the problem here, that there isn't a complete separation between party and state, that people still play dual roles where it's not clear whether they're speaking as ministers of government, ministers of state, or whether they're speaking as party members. And that distinction actually must be drawn more clearly by journalists, by ordinary people. When we report on stories, look at stories, it should be clear to us whether this person is there in their capacity as a member of a party or a member of government. Because again, the question is asked, who paid for them to be there? What cavalcade did they take? What security measures are in place? And are they there in their official capacity, in which case what they speak is policy? Or are they there in their capacity as a party member, in which case we shouldn't pay for motorized vehicles to take them these long distances?
I suppose in the end it boils down to what's always been the sort of strangeness, the big complication here, which is that it was not just that a former president of a democratic society was going to jail as ordered to by a court. it was that former president's political party was still in power. To put it another way, in most countries where a former head of state has actually gone to jail, a different political party has been in power. Often they've lost an election to that political party. But in this case, it was someone within the same party. And that's really the complication, isn't it? I mean, it's actually quite a rare thing that's happened here, and this is why.
But also this is a party that, as its manifesto in its sixth administration said, it steps away from, and I'm using the words of the current president of the party and president of the Republic of South Africa, the 9 wasted years. And part of that means having to stand by the principle rather than the personality, choosing to go constitution rather than cult. And these alliterations aren't just, cheap linguistic tricks. They're actually fundamental components of the society we live in. And the fact that there still seem to be people who are members of the party and have positions in government and can't make that distinction speaks volumes to the struggle inside the ANC, which should never have become a struggle inside the country as a whole. We cannot be held ransom as a country of 60 million people to the internal dynamics and power struggles of a party that has a few million members and has 11 million of the population voting for it. This really isn't sort of a denigration of the party as a whole. No party should be able to hold an entire population of a country to ransom because it needs to peaceably or in an ameliorated fashion solve its internal crisis. The internal crisis of one organization shouldn't become the internal crisis of an entire country. That speaks, I think, to a failure to observe the distinction between a party and the society that it is electorally mandated to manage.
There's a bigger conversation around how unhappy almost everybody is with our economy, particularly the people who are sort of almost structurally, I suppose, outside it and unable to get into it. But that takes us to a bigger question around our politics. And I get the sense sometimes that everyone's angry about our politics. I'm sure you get asked, Angelo, who should I vote for? Because people are frustrated with all of our political parties. What does that tell us about our political system? Does it tell us that our political system has failed? Does it tell us that just the parties we have at the moment have failed? Does it tell us that there's a gaping vacuum, there are constituencies that aren't represented in formal politics? And if they aren't represented in formal politics, that means it's easier to move to informal politics, which often is a much more complicated thing to assess.
So we've had constitutional court judgments on this where the tension between loyalty to the organization that deploys you into the position where you can be elected and the oath of office that elected officials take to stand by the Constitution has come into open, debate. And the Constitutional Court made the judgment that we need electoral reform. The electoral reform is that there should be greater space for independent candidates to stand in provincial and national elections. And this then will allow people who aren't beholden to parties to begin to represent and be held accountable by people who elect them more directly. One of the concerns that is a global concern that has now finally hit South Africans full on is that political parties and the people in them often are subjected to the sort of tensions that political parties have in their relationships with capitalists, business people, and other financial stakeholders. And so, the tension is that we vote for these people, but they don't necessarily only represent themselves. Pablo Iglesias of the Podemos movement in Spain wrote of this when he said that what they call the caste in Spain turned out to be politicians beholden to capitalists and not necessarily to the people who vote for them. And so you have democracy on paper, but in practice, you have a kind of oligarchy, an elite that rules and governs in the interests of businesses rather than of people. And to some extent, that model has been metastasized to larger and transnational sections. So the European Central Bank, the European Commission, the Troika, as Varoufakis, the former Minister of Finance for Greece, called the shots, and all sorts of national sovereignty questions and all sorts of abilities by citizens to hold their governments to account, falls by the wayside. South Africa has experience of this in the 2010 World Cup, where, FIFA was able to change laws and get instant court systems put in place in a way that ordinary South African citizens, having agitated for them for, 15 years at that point, couldn't. And so what we're sitting with here is the need to transform the system rather than simply to replace parties, and also to have much more participative democracy rather than simply the kind of representative systems where it isn't, a kind of mystery why we have the system and the crises we do, because organizations often override individuals' desires. And if individuals can stand on their own, there may be a chance for ordinary people to elect people they know, who continue to live in their communities, continue to have to use the services they do to represent their interests in Parliament, rather than via a complicated party system that is much more prone to patronage networks and exploitation by really greedy people who want to use the political system to enrich themselves.
So, I mean, we know that transforming a political system is very, very hard. And probably in many situations, one of the reasons it's hard, perhaps the biggest reason, is that someone's going to lose out. So someone's in power through a system. In this case, it would be the ANC that's in power through a system. They understand that system. It works for them. I think this would probably extend to the DA too, maybe even the EFF perhaps. And it's a system that they know and that they can manipulate, and they can sort of work in it. They feel very comfortable in it because it gets them into Parliament. But to force them to change, it's actually really, really hard, especially when one of the organizations is in government. Is it really possible to transform the political system that we have? And I'm reminded of how difficult it was to negotiate the system that we have in the 90s.
And that system is under constant negotiation. Every time we act in South Africa as political actors, we are reinscribing that system or damaging it. And so the separation of powers is what brought us to the reform of the electoral system, precisely because the judiciary cannot only be instructed by the executive on how to behave. And so citizens' rights, the constitutionality of the South African democratic experiment, is what is a strength or a pillar in electoral reform. What also has to reform, though, is not just the party system or parties themselves, but also voters and citizens, ordinary people's expectations of their politicians, their understanding of how political systems could work to their advantage. All of that needs to shift, and that means that critical literate education is going to be central in this. And one of the major failures of post-apartheid South Africa, which is probably part or near the core of so many of the other social, economic, and political problems, is our failure to provide ordinary people with a critical literate education such that they don't have to listen for politicians, pastors, pundits like myself to tell them what to think. They will be able to know how to think and be able to, make decisions that are informed not just by their own immediate interests, but by the interests of the people that will come after them, their own children, and by the environment in which they have to live and that their children have to live in for the next century. Because politicians and business people have very short-term goals, profit or power. Ordinary people have much longer-term goals, which is why they have children. They invest in being in certain spaces and being in certain relationships. And that disjuncture means that we have to change what our politics delivers, and that means how we engage political processes will also have to change. We have to be far more proactive. And we have examples of people doing this over the last 15 months through their community action networks, through the examples of communities working together over the last few days to make sure that their infrastructure, their ways of being are protected and not further damaged. And that is a method that I think is important in an emergency to begin to use more effectively and daily in almost every aspect of life, not just to wait for the crisis to implement it, but to implement it through the crisis and beyond it.
Angelo Fick, thanks very much indeed. Really do appreciate it. As I talk to you, I can see your copy of Catch 22 on your bookcase. Thanks very much indeed.